What starts as a journey into the wilds of Zion National Park quickly takes a turn for the worse. Trapped with no way to escape, you soon find yourself caught up in a deadly tribal conflict. In some ways, it's the weakest of the 4 major DLCs, but like the core game of New Vegas, its scope was rigged from the start. This is the development and cut content of Honest Hearts. Honest Hearts was Fallout New Vegas' second DLC, and was initially released on May 17, 2011, nearly 5 months after Dead Money's release. This was the longest gap between any of the DLCs, but unintuitively, Honest Hearts actually had the shortest development cycle. Some early work began on it a day after the core game's release, and continued throughout Dead Money's development. After Dead Money's Xbox release in late December of 2010, the majority of the dev team continued work on the upcoming PC and PS3 releases, while core game patches were still being worked on. After Dead Money was released on all platforms, many team members skipped over Honest Hearts and immediately began work on Old World Blues. This means that it was essentially made by a small skeleton crew over a period of 7 months, a constraint that would limit nearly every aspect of the DLC. Josh Sawyer commented on this in a Tumblr post. Honest Hearts had more than a month of development time, but it had less development time than any of the other big DLCs, i.e. not including Gunrunner's Arsenal. I wrote Joshua Graham and Daniel, Travis Stout wrote Follows Chalk, Waking Cloud, and Salt Upon Wounds, and John Gonzalez, FNV's narrative lead, wrote the Happy Trails Party and the Survivalist logs. I believe Travis Stout and Sydney Wolfram, maybe Charlie Staples, were the only 2 area designers on the project, and their time was limited. While it wasn't officially announced until late April, fans suspected Joshua Graham and New Canaan would be involved in an upcoming DLC because of graffiti that appeared in the base game. This was seemingly confirmed when the texture for Honest Hearts Snow Globe was discovered in Dead Money's game files only a few weeks after its release. Later in January of 2011, the terms Honest Hearts, Old World Blues, and Lonesome Road would be trademarked, leading to further speculation. In April, a few screenshots from an early trailer leaked, showing the title, landscape, and combat. Unfortunately, the full video of this early trailer was never released, but it likely had many differences compared to the final game, considering how short the DLC's development was. Honest Hearts is started by traveling to the location Northern Passage. This area was in the core game, but the entrance was blocked by boulders. An invisible wall made it impossible to reach the entrance under normal circumstances, but the interior still appeared. Installing the DLC alters both the interior and exterior cells. The boulders are removed from the wasteland, and the cave entrance is strangely changed, making it look worse, I think. Inside the cave, the Happy Trail NPCs are added, and strangely 2 of the lights are cut, likely to improve console performance. In the core game, there are 7 lights that zigzag from either side of the level, and from the right perspective you can see all of them, along with the light from the cave exit, which is a great effect. Another change was the addition of an out-of-bounds terminal above the tunnel that's used to play the Happy Trails radio station. Jed and the other members of the Happy Trails Caravan are marked essential when first met, making them impossible to kill. Not only are they immortal, they also have the ghost state applied to them, which causes projectiles to pass through them. However, there's evidence you had the option to immediately kill all of them at one point in development. There's an unused message that's a Pulp Fiction reference called "Jed's dead, baby, Jed's dead." After killing Jed, it would have appeared along with the Vault Boy in Pain image. It reads, "You've killed Jed Masterson. Without his maps and mountaineering expertise, you'll never make it to Zion. Killing Jed has rendered the Honest Hearts DLC inaccessible. Please reload your last save if you wish to play Honest Hearts." Now, I can see why this was cut, as there isn't much point in killing them if you're going to reload a save right afterwards. But it's still a testament to how dedicated Obsidian is to player agency and making all NPCs vulnerable. This is something that Bethesda has become notably worse about in recent titles and could definitely learn from. All of the Caravan characters have lines for the player stealing from them, but a script makes it impossible to pickpocket them at any point, meaning these lines can never play.
That doesn't belong to you.
You can't just take that.
Thief!
Jed has an unused topic named Speech 75, and perhaps you could convince him to pay you more. There are dialogue options that allow you to bring more gear into Zion, and it might have had the same effect. If you have the strong back perk, this dialogue option becomes available while talking to Jed. Not only could I carry my own gear, I could carry yours, his, and one of your Brahmin. This line suggests that Brahmin were going to appear initially, but there are no Brahmin near the Caravan NPCs at any point apart from the ending slides. There's an unused texture for a sign that reads Happy Trails Caravan Company. There's also a cut model that reuses elements of the Goodspring sign, and it's essentially a scaled down retexture. It's completely unknown where this would have been used, however. It's animated, so it might have appeared somewhere in Zion, but the most likely explanation is that it would have been used during the ending slide where the Happy Trails Caravan Company returns to prosperity. In the final game, all endings for the Happy Trails Caravan Company use the exact same image. If you look closely, you'll see they reuse Jed and the Caravan guards for this image, even though they all die at the start of the DLC. One of the intro slides depicts New Canaan, an area that never appears in the final game. The geography and weather suggest they modified an area near Goodsprings to make New Canaan. One of the NPCs appears to be the lady you save from geckos in Goodsprings, and strangely she's used twice. The other NPCs are all from Goodsprings as well. Since it was made in the base game, they deleted the area prior to the DLC shipping, and the only place this church model is used in the final game is at Camp Searchlight. There's an unused younger version of Caesar and Joshua Graham in the game files. These were used to create some of the intro slides, and the animations used in these slides still remain. One was used to make Caesar point, another made Joshua point his weapon, and several animations for looking down were used in Joshua's execution scene. Caesar's younger model is essentially identical to the real one, except that he's going bald. This suggests Caesar was intended to be bald in the final game, which would have made this make sense. However, there isn't actually a fully bald hairstyle in New Vegas, and the closest option is a buzz cut, making this younger version outright confusing. Notably, young Joshua's karma was marked evil even though he isn't used, while the real Joshua Graham has good karma. Strangely, young Joshua has a different face than the one you meet in-game. The real Joshua Graham does have a face beneath his bandages, but there are no burns, and disappointingly his face is a copy of a generic NPC. Joshua doesn't wear the Legate's armor in these slides, and is strangely wearing the exact same clothes he has in-game, minus the bandages. Josh Sawyer revealed why they didn't give him Lanius's armor. Lanius' armor seemed inappropriate for Graham. Though it's unlikely Joshua would have worn the same clothes that he does when you meet him in Honest Hearts, there weren't a lot of other appropriate clothes for him, and his outfit does make him stand out as particularly unusual, which, even among the Legion, he was. Unfortunately, there are no unique slides for any of the endings, and regardless of your choices, every slide is always the same. All of the slides were also made using in-game screenshots, unlike the amazing art featured in the other DLCs. Obsidian wanted to include these for Honest Hearts, but sadly didn't have time to implement them, and some of the slides that got in feel rushed. After arriving in Zion, the Caravan company is ambushed and killed, leaving the player as the only survivor. This sequence has a significant amount that was cut from it. Before traveling to Zion, you can talk to Ricky and discover he has a chem addiction. The player can then sell him Psycho or Fixer, and doing this changes his behavior/dialogue. Normally, Ricky cowers during the ambush, but if the player sells him chems, he talks shit before dying. The player's actions were also meant to change the conversation dialogue that happens before the ambush starts, but none of these lines ever play. If the player sold Ricky Psycho or Fixer, these lines would play. The first line has some notes for Ricky's voice actor Scott McNeil that are pretty great. High on Psycho, yelling out to the canyon.
Oh man, yeah. Trigger finger is feeling itchy. Come on, assholes. Show yourselves, and Deadeye Ricky will blow your fucking heads off.
Shut your mouth, you goddamn junkie, or I'll plant one between your shoulder blades, I swear.
Don't worry, Stella. This was my last hit, but thanks to old Johnny-come-lately over there, Ricky got some Fixer to take the edge off. Don't worry, Stella. This was my last hit, but thanks to old Janie-come-lately over there, Ricky got some Fixer to take the edge off.
Best fix for you'd be a bullet in the brain pan. Now shut it.
If the player sold him a large amount of Psycho, he'd be high as fuck and say this line.
Don't worry, Stella. Old Ricky won't be running out of Psycho anytime soon. Old Ricky's downright flush. Yes, indeed.
Stella's next line has a note that reads, Ricky just boasted he has plenty of drugs.
Sounds like you got enough for a fatal overdose then. Do us all a favor, will ya?
Dream on, Stella. Ricky ain't about to die for nobody. Ricky's fucking invincible. Yes, sir.
God damn it, never should have joined this ass-backwards caravan.
If the player didn't sell Ricky any chems, these lines would play instead.
I ain't feeling good, man. I feel like shit. I got the shakes. Got the sweats. This fucking sucks.
Enough! Another word of your bitching and I'll put you out of your misery myself.
You don't know how this feels, Stella. I'm sick. Never been so sick my whole life.
You ain't sick. You're a goddamn junkie, that's what you are, so shut it.
You ain't got no heart, Stella. I swear, you're a monster. And you're gonna regret treating me like this.
Didn't nobody do this to you but yourself, junkie. Now try suffering in silence for once.
The player can also make Ricky leave the expedition before it starts, and Stella was meant to have additional dialogue if this happened, but these lines never play either.
Sorry to bother you with reality, old Jed. Who cares if we can't get back out the way we come? That's not a problem. Heard you the 15th time, Stella. What's it matter if we're trapped here? Everything will be just fine. Oh, I'm sure you're right, Jed. What's the worst can happen to us out here? Nothing. Perfectly safe. Fucking perfectly. That's right, little lady. Everything will be just fine with Jed to protect you. Quite the leader is what I am. Hell yes.
There are some generic guards who spawn ahead of you and die almost immediately. They have no unique dialogue in the final game, but that wasn't always meant to be the case. Each guard has a cut line that was meant to play during the beginning of the ambush. There are conditions for these to play, and specific voice files are linked to these topics, but both lines are sadly missing. The first line reads, "Alarmed, just recognize they've been ambushed. Ambush, tribals, and they mean blood." The second line reads, "Takes initiative and moves forward to explore threat. I'll take a look, boss. Keep me covered." A note for the voice actor of Jed describes the ambush and makes it sound awesome, trying to calm his crew under an onslaught of fire and flying tomahawks. This suggests that tomahawks were meant to be introduced during the initial attack, but only one of the attackers has tomahawks, and unless you're looking for them, it's easy to miss that they're even a part of the battle. Jed has an unused line for the ambush, and it has a note that reads, "Notices the player being hit and falling down and rushes to aid. Helps player on his or her feet."
On your feet. Keep fighting. Come on now. I got you.
This suggests the player was once going to get hit and knocked down in some sort of scripted event, then Jed would run over and pick them up. It seems likely you would have been hit by one of the DLC's new weapons, perhaps by the previously mentioned flying tomahawks. There's a related unused AI package called Intro White Legs Attack Player, and it's linked to a marker placed beyond the point that any of the Caravan NPCs live to reach, suggesting that at least Jed was intended to live longer. There's many other unused AI packages that are remnants of the original ambush. These were used to either play dialogue or have the White Legs attack the Caravan NPCs. One of them is a White Legs Guard package, which can be used to make characters guard a location, object, or NPC, though it's unclear which of these they were protecting. Jed also has a cut Forscrete dialogue topic that would have occurred during the ambush, potentially right after picking the player up, but that line is missing too. Ricky, Stella, and Jed also have unused lines for the player trespassing.
You better get out of here if you know what's good for you.
You'd better get out of here if you know what's good for you.
You better get out of here if you know what's good for you.
Daniel and Saltapun wounds have these exact same lines too, and I'm guessing these were recorded just in case they were needed, but they weren't.
You better get out of here if you know what's good for you.
You'd better get out of here if you know what's good for you.
South of your starting location, there's a very interesting area in an inaccessible part of the map. There's a weird stretched texture here that was pretty clearly a river at one point. Water is even shown on this part of the Pip-Boy map, suggesting there was water here when the map was made, but it isn't there now. There's also a random set of planks not far from here that the player can normally never see. Tantalizingly, there's a stranded piece of nav mesh right beside it. It seems this entire area was reworked later in development, and that this is all that remains from their original vision. This is only a theory, but I suspect the Caravan once spawned by the wooden planks, or perhaps even further south. Supporting this, the river texture extends a very long way, and this whole region has a level of detail not seen in other inaccessible areas of Zion. It's possible you'd walk up to the point where the DLC now starts, which would have given the player an impressive reveal of the world space. Perhaps much of the cut dialogue would have played as you made your way there, and Jed has an unused line that was possibly intended to play here.
Come on, down this path. We're almost there.
The Caravan might have even been accompanied by Brahmin who would be killed during the ambush. There's a dead Brahmin near the DLC starting position that's implied to have fallen off a cliff, and maybe the Caravan Brahmin would have met a similar fate. Shit gets deeper though. Beneath the ground where the DLC starts, there's a randomly placed cliff that must have been moved here once the area to the south was cut. There's two very interesting triggers here called ambush avoided. Perhaps the player's choices could have led to the Caravan avoiding the ambush entirely and surviving. If so, this must have been cut very early, as there's no other content related to them surviving. A more likely explanation is that it was an option for pacifist players to avoid the ambush, and that the fate of the Caravan NPCs would have remained the same. Regardless of how it would have played out, this scene was obviously intended to be longer and more cinematic. Jed, Ricky, and Stella are all great characters that don't get much screen time, and it's a shame their recorded lines didn't get used, particularly considering how little dialogue Honest Hearts has in the first place. Beyond what's cut from the ambush, the scene has some interesting elements in and of itself. You can't actually save any of the Happy Trails Caravan NPCs as their deaths are scripted. Further, one of the White Legs can't even be killed until after all the Caravan NPCs die. Some of the White Leg NPCs are also set to very low health, which is why they can be killed so easily. After the player escapes the ambush, the companion Fallustrok is introduced, and this scene is more than a little confusing. A White Legs NPC attacks the player as they cross the bridge, and Fallustrok sneaks up behind them before killing them. However, it's possible to kill the White Legs NPC before Fallustrok reaches him, and then attack Fallustrok out of confusion. This immediately fails the main storyline and starts the Chaos in Zion quest. Some players players were so confused by this scene, they thought Chaos in Zion was the entire DLC. In a Formspring post, Josh Sawyer revealed this scene was altered late in development. The main quests were primarily designed to be straightforward and hard to break. Several of FNV's quests went against the basic structure of the engine, and in almost all cases, it resulted in a high degree of fragility and/or confusion for players. DLCs do not have long development cycles, so I wanted to mitigate the potential for main quest bugs by keeping them simple. In fact, the one major main quest break that many players have noted, Followstruck being easily winged or killed during his initial appearance, was something that went in late in the cycle and shouldn't have. This could have been circumvented by spawning Followstruck after the White Legs were dead, then he could force greet the player to initiate a conversation from a long distance. And apparently that's how the scene once played out too. That is the way it originally worked. He appeared unarmed on the rock waving at you and initiated conversation when you were halfway across the bridge. Someone suggested the version that eventually shipped minus the bugs. It's ultimately my responsibility, but I wish we had left it the way it was. The names for the variables that handle this scene are called Followstruck brains a dude and Followstruck shoots a dead dude. Fucking wholesome, dude. Not long after meeting Followstruck, there's an awesome scene where Yao Guai and green geckos are introduced. From the player's perspective, it looks like the Yao Guai kills the gecko, but the way this scene actually works is pretty cool. The player passes through a trigger which spawns the green gecko. As the Yao Guai approaches it, the gecko gets launched by the push command. The Yao Guai attack sound is played, then the gecko is killed as it gets launched in front of the player. Afterwards, the Yao Guai shows off and then runs out of sight. Typically when a creature is used in a scripted scene like this, they get disabled after they move out of sight. This Yao Guai runs up the nearby cliff and becomes a part of the world though. There is even a chance of one of its cubs spawning, so you can even hunt its children, which is a really cool metal detail you could easily miss. Unless you're playing the PS3 version, because it turns out that nearly all of the scene was cut out of that port. The sound effects still play, and Followstruck still comments on the scene, but neither of the creatures spawn. It's almost a running joke how much worse the PS3 port is, so I guess I shouldn't be surprised that one of the DLC's best moments is now a terrifying mess. Here's a clip of a really confused player getting freaked out by a non-existent Yao Guai. I genuinely have to wonder how many fans have been jump scared by this and never knew what was going on. After talking to Followstruck, the player travels to the Dead Horses camp and meets Joshua Graham. He sends you to collect various items to help the Dead Horses and Sorrows leave Zion. One of these quests is called Roadside Attraction, and in it the player recovers and repairs a broken compass. You're also given the optional objective to take Followstruck as a guide. You don't have to take him as a guide though, as the locations of the items are already marked on your map, but it seems it wasn't always going to be this way. There's a cut terminal called Ranger Terminal that was meant to appear at the Ranger Station. There's still a terminal here in the final game, but it can't be used. It would have displayed the welcome text Zion National Park Network and given you the option to download the Grand Staircase map. Downloading it would complete the optional objective to take Followstruck as a guide, which suggests the map revealed the locations of the items. The map image that would have been given to the player still remains. This objective was later cut though, and recovering this map would be repurposed to the quest The Grand Staircase. For whatever reason, they didn't reuse the map image or the terminal though, and the map is instead found on a holotape in one of the Survivalist caves. It does make sense that Randall Clark would have collected something so valuable, but they should have reused the image. There's a cut medkit item, and its quest prefix reveals it's an early version of the item found during the quest tourist trap. There's an unused message called How to Fix Stuff, and it reads, if you don't have the parts or the skills to make repairs in the field, you can take the medical kit to a repair bench and fix it there. There's an unused activator and code for a mine detector, but neither reveals how it would have functioned. Its quest prefix reveals it was part of the third main quest, but the third main quest is technically 5 separate quests, so it isn't clear which one it belonged to. Perhaps the player needed to recover it so the Sorrows and Dead Horses could avoid traps set by the Whitelegs. This might be an early remnant of the quest The Treacherous Road, a quest where the player either disarms traps or kills the Whiteleg sappers laying them. Joshua mentions that the Whitelegs raided an armory at Spanish Fork, which explains their relatively high level of weaponry. In the final game they only used bear traps, but it would have made sense for them to use mines considering their lore. During the quest Gone Fishing, the player has to recover a set of walkie-talkies. There's an unused message that suggests they were going to be damaged and needed to be repaired, just like the compass and medkit need to be fixed. It reads, this walkie-talkie is broken, but can possibly be restored to a fully functioning state. Repair of 30 or greater required. There's an additional cut message that reads, the electronics in this walkie-talkie are badly damaged. If you replace them, the process will be much simpler. Requires 1 pile of scrap electronics. There's also an unused message called Repair Combat Message that reads, you don't have the time to examine this object in the heat of battle. This is likely related to the cut walkie-talkie objective or the unused medkit. The crux of the story comes down to choosing between Joshua Graham and Daniel. If the player supports Joshua, you're given the quest Crush the Whitelegs. After traveling to the 3 Marys, Joshua force greets the player before jarringly teleporting away.
This is taking too long. We can't let Salt Upon Wounds escape. I'm going to find a way around. God willing, we will finish this together.
The player was meant to have the goodbye dialogue option, I'll see you on the other side, but this never appears. Joshua would then reply in one of 2 ways depending on the player's gender.
Go with God, brother. Go with God, sister.
You also could have asked him about Salt Upon Wounds, but this option never becomes available either.
He's a butcher. Believe me, I know the godless fire that burns in his heart. I've been burned by it myself. He's not the kind to let his subordinates do all the killing. No, he likes to have a hand in it, with that spear of his. He's fashioned himself an abomination before the eyes of the Lord. I'm happy to serve as an instrument of divine justice.
Joshua Graham's voice acting is incredible, and it's too bad any of his lines were cut. Luckily, these topics can be restored using an optional file from the mod Uncut Wasteland, which I've linked below. Later, the player meets back up with Joshua Graham, who's on the verge of executing the leader of the Whitelegs, Salt Upon Wounds. You can talk him down and let Salt Upon Wounds run away, fight Salt Upon Wounds, or allow Joshua to execute him. Prior to this choice, Joshua Graham says something in a tribal language to Salt Upon Wounds, but it's unclear what he's saying.
Kale wachene conserva o. You understand me, don't you?
Josh Sawyer commented on why he'll never reveal what Joshua said. Years ago, Ridley Scott changed Blade Runner. He decided to change an ambiguous aspect of the central character to something not ambiguous at all. The movie that Blade Runner fans fell in love with because of that central uncertainty lost something because the author simply changed his mind years after the fact. I think that authors of content should leave the interpretive aspects of their narrative work alone once it goes out into the world for consumption. I think we should discuss it, argue about it, but we shouldn't try to reframe it. It shouldn't really matter whether what's in there is intentional or accidental. It's what's in the game and what the player experiences that matter. Before starting Crush the Whitelegs, the area where the massacre takes place is blocked off by a boulder, but during the quest, the player is teleported past it. After Salt Upon Wounds is taken care of, the ending slides start, and then the player is warped to the DLC's exit. There are some containers at the execution site, but they can only be attained by either going out of your way to grab them while fighting Salt Upon Wounds, or returning after the quest is completed. It seems strange to to me at first they added these containers, considering how unlikely it is for a player to actually loot them, but this scene was apparently much different earlier in development. There's a note for some unused code intended for the execution scene that reads, "Makes white legs and pull aggressive if Salt Upon Wounds is killed before talking to player. However, you never have the chance to kill Salt Upon Wounds before speaking to him. This cut code also makes 5 white legs hostile to the player. If you choose to fight Salt Upon Wounds in the final game, 3 white leg NPCs respawn to fight alongside him. Notably, the 5 white legs mentioned in that cut script weren't being spawned, and it seems they were already present in the scene. There are 2 white legs in the final scene, but Joshua immediately executes them. Notably, the faction of the white legs Joshua executes contains an additional NPC as well, suggesting he was going to kill a 3rd hostage before moving on to Salt Upon Wounds. Daniel has an unused AI package to fight Salt Upon Wounds at this location too. In the final game he never even appears here though, but he was clearly once a part of the Crush the White Legs quest. It seems the ending of this quest was much different earlier in development, but it's difficult to speculate further with so little information. After completing Crush the White Legs, the Sorrows and Dead Horses are supposed to stay in Zion, but Daniel, Joshua, Whitebird, Follows Chalk, and Waking Cloud are all disabled afterwards. I'm guessing they didn't have the budget to record additional lines for post-DLC reactivity, so they disabled them. If the player supports Daniel, he has a line where he gives the player a map that shows them how to escape Zion. However, if you support Joshua, there's no line like this, even though being unable to leave is the catalyst for the player getting involved in the DLC story. There is a map in the chest that appears at the end of the DLC, but it would have been nice if Joshua at least mentioned it. Josh Sawyer revealed how he would have improved this scene. I think having a route out of Zion defined by Follow Chalk and Waking Cloud would have been a great addition, though honestly, I don't think there would have been time to develop it. If the player supports Daniel's belief that the Sorrows and Dead Horses should leave their new home, you're given the quest Flight from Zion. You're also given several other optional quests at this point, and one of them revolves around rescuing members of the Sorrows/Dead Horses who have been taken prisoner by the White Legs. There's an unused faction that contains no NPCs called Captive Sorrows faction, suggesting there might have been even more hostages, potentially at another location at one point in development. After completing the quest and speaking to Daniel, the player has to detonate C4 at the Pine Creek Tunnel. Your controls are locked during this scene, and you can't see everything that's going on because of it. There's a nice detail where C4 has been placed above the tunnel, and the rocks actually tumble down to block the exit. It's really cool getting to see this scene from an out-of-bounds perspective.
Foolish, Outman. You best white legs you think. By my spear you die!
The White Legs are a faction of tribal raiders who descended from pre-war tourists near the Great Salt Lake. They don't have traditional survival skills and instead have become well-versed raiders who take what they need from other groups. They were trained by Ulysses and destroyed New Canaan. In theory, they could have been a great faction, but in practice, they ended up somewhat forgettable. It would have drastically improved Honest Hearts if you had the option to support the White Legs in their fight against the Dead Horses and Sorrows. Josh Sawyer commented on the possibility of this questline, stating, "We talked about it briefly, but the time schedule for Honest Hearts was very short, so it never seemed like something we could feasibly support. If there were time to build a full pro-White Legs quest, not so much a pro-Legion quest, I think that would have been nice to add. I still think it would have been important to structure the quest in such a way that the themes of the DLC were not lost." In a separate post, he expanded on this even more and gave some insight to their connection with the Legion. Helping the White Legs wouldn't really help the Legion in any substantive way, unless you consider helping Caesar clean up an embarrassing mistake to be inherently pro-Legion. It's worth noting that if you do Chaos in Zion and actually kill Joshua Graham yourself, the White Legs still aren't accepted into the Legion. Caesar just wants Graham dead, and the White Legs are the scumbags to do it. We discussed doing a White Legs oriented path through Honest Hearts, but A, it would have been out of scope, and B, it still likely would have ended with you doing essentially Chaos and Zion, killing Daniel and /or Joshua Graham. In retrospect, associating the White Legs with the Legion was probably my key mistake. Take the exact same tribe doing the exact same thing and remove their association with the Legion, and people would not conclude that opposing them equals opposing the Legion, or that helping the New Canaanites equals helping the Legion's enemies. The New Canaanites, though fundamentally opposed to the Legion, aren't really parties in the conflict. Caesar hates Joshua Graham, regardless of the lack of threat posed by New Canaan, the Sorrows, and the Dead Horses. The White Legs have lines for yielding in combat, but these can never actually be played since they're always hostile to the player, except in scenes at the end of the main questline. Perhaps these were recorded when they still had some hope of implementing the aforementioned questline, or at the very least scenes where they were not hostile and the player still had control. They say the word Maiku, which according to a note is the tribe's word for okay.
Maiku.
Michael.
An interesting aspect of the White Legs is their hair, and it's braided this way out of respect for Ulysses. In a holotape in Lonesome Road, Ulysses mentions this.
They brought me before the campfire one night, showed me how they changed themselves, how they wore their hair now. It was like my entire dead tribe in the firelight, teeth grinning red in the dark, eager corpses, blood-covered ghosts. They had taken my braids, the way of the twisted hairs, as if it showed they were like me, of me, while every knot in their braids spoke of raping, violence, and ignorance of what the knots meant. They thought to show respect, defiled it. Lost myself in trying to read the braids they wove, when I remembered they had put no meaning in it. They had no history of what it meant. They didn't even know the insult in the twists, knots.
Ulysses comments that he finds their hairstyle disrespectful since the White Legs don't know the meaning of the knots, though the actual meaning of them is never revealed in-game. In a Twitter post, Chris Avalone revealed the braids' meaning for the twisted hairs. They stored their histories and messages/signs in their hair to other tribe members, married/how many kills/profession. Their hair is also interesting from a technical perspective, as it's not actual hair like other characters have, but rather a unique type of headwear that isn't marked as playable. Like other hats, it has weight, durability, and is even worth 8 caps. It also gives them a +1 bonus to their perception. There's a dead White Legs NPC who is never used, and it's unclear where she was meant to appear. It's possible she was intended for the attack on the White Legs camp at the end of the DLC, but it's also possible she was meant to appear as environmental storytelling in another part of Zion. There's also 3 disabled map markers near the exit of the Three Marys Cave. Only one of them has a name though, and it would have been called White Legs Camp. Unfortunately, it's unclear what the purpose of the other 2 markers was. It's worth noting the area designers did an awesome job designing the Three Marys. Trees, tents, and torches are placed throughout inaccessible areas that makes the White Leg settlement seem much larger than it actually is. I love clipping around and getting to see how these perspective tricks improve the DLC's finale. Obsidian even considered recording more dialogue for Caesar, but Josh Sawyer revealed why they didn't. Because rehiring a voice actor, especially a high-profile voice actor like John Doman, isn't always simple, and touching Caesar's dialogue in the core game, well, it's already really complicated. And introducing elements that could affect the critical path is pretty dangerous, especially if it's accomplished through the DLC files, because we couldn't patch it. It's too bad they couldn't record additional dialogue for Caesar, as it would have been so satisfying to tell him you either helped or killed Joshua Graham. Veronica's post-Dead Money dialogue illustrated just how far a few extra lines can go. Honest Hearts has a relatively simple quest structure compared to some of the quests that appeared in the base game. You collect a compass, lunchboxes, a medkit, a map, and some totems, which are the definition of fetch quest. Josh Sawyer revealed why the DLC was intentionally designed this way. On Fallout New Vegas, I learned the ship date of the game when I saw it on a trailer on the floor of E3. It's the only game I've worked on where the ship date did not move a single day from when people above me decided it was going to ship. I had to force a lot of content to be cut because the schedule just didn't allow enough time for everything to get finished. I also cut the post-in-game content for that reason. Eric Finstermaker urged me to cut Caravan because it needed more iteration, but obviously I didn't. Both Chris Avallone and I tried to keep the DLC content tightly controlled because of the short development cycles. E.g. on Honest Hearts, Travis Stout, Sidney Wolfram, and other designers wanted to make the quests more interesting / complex, but I was pretty draconian about their simplicity because we had no margin for slipping. In a separate post, he expanded even further. I think it's less about what else I would have included, and what more we would have tried to do overall. Before Honest Hearts even started development, I looked at the larger team's overall schedule, with the expectation that work on core FNV, patching, and Dead Money, PS3/PC, would extend beyond the Christmas window, and the understanding that many folks on the Dead Money team would then roll over to Old World Blues. It was clear to me that Honest Hearts was not going to get a luxurious amount of time. Everything on Honest Hearts, with the exception of the opening fight, which took a little longer than expected and generally was my bad idea, was designed to be extremely straightforward and simple in execution. It's not that the team didn't have interesting ideas, I just summarily regulated everything with complexity to the back end of development. The idea was that a solid core, if plain, was still solid. If we had time to experiment around that core later, we could do so. Surprise, more time didn't come. That might seem strange since there was a large delay between Dead Money and Honest Hearts, but Honest Hearts stopped development well ahead of Old World Blues. In the meantime, we were developing a code fix that was necessary for both Honest Hearts and Old World Blues, but the content in Honest Hearts was locked fairly early. Honest Hearts has, effectively, fetch quests because as soon as we started implementing new and zany things, a mental hourglass was draining in my imagination with a laughing skeletal figure looming over it. It's genuinely sad there wasn't more time to create more elaborate quest and a White Legs quest line, as these are undoubtedly some of Honest Hearts' weakest elements. One of Honest Hearts' best aspects is its loot. From the War Club to the 45, tomahawks, Desert Ranger armor, and the compliance regulator, it has some of my favorite items in the entire game. And of course it has several cut or inaccessible items. It seems the 45 auto pistol was originally intended to have an improved sights mod, but at some point this mod was cut and applied to the default version of the weapon. Static versions of the weapon and Fallows Truck 45 were never updated though, and are still missing their improved sights. This likely would have increased the weapon's accuracy, and it's unclear why it was made into the default weapon sight. At the end of the DLC, there's a reward footlocker. It's actually floating off the ground though if you look closely. One of the items contained in it is Joshua Graham's unique pistol, A Light in Shining Darkness. But the weapon the player is given is actually a different gun than the one he uses, and his variant deals significantly more damage. The engraving on the pistol is the Bible passage, "The light shines in darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it." The player is also given Joshua's outfit at the end of the DLC, but again Joshua has a unique, unplayable version of the armor, and his variant has arm bandages. His head bandages aren't marked as playable either, which is too bad because it looks awesome. Another item in the footlocker is a miscellaneous item named Scripture, which is the same Bible read by both Joshua and Daniel. There's also an unused static object called Scripture. This static object was meant to appear somewhere in the environment, most likely at the Sorrows and Dead Horses camps. If you tell Joshua Graham to use melee, he uses a powerful pistol whip attack, and it's actually a unique, unattainable weapon called Joshua's Pistol Whip in 45. It has the same object effect as boxing gloves, and inflicts fatigue on top of dealing a significant amount of damage. It even has a unique VATS attack called Lights Out, potentially implying the dev team wanted the player to have access to it at one point, though it's certainly possible the attack was simply made for fun. There are several poisoned weapons used by the Whitelegs that can never be attained by the player. These weapons always have the Dark Datura poison effect applied to them. One of these weapons is completely unused though, a shish kebab that deals poison damage, and like other Whitelegs weapons, this wouldn't have been available to the player. This would have been a very powerful weapon, and I'm guessing it was cut to make Whitelegs encounters easier. Despite being cut, it was shown off prominently during the trailer. There's an unused Pip-Boy icon for a weapon called Bug Spray. There's no model or code, but presumably it was going to function like the Flamer. It was a great idea, and it's too bad they didn't have time to implement it. It's possible this was linked to an also cut dungeon. There's a secondary location called Ant Burrow. Fallis Chuck has a comment about it, and there's a few ants you can fight, but it's otherwise a forgettable area. However, it was apparently meant to be an accessible dungeon, as the burrow is named Zion Ant Cave Door 01. There are Ant Burrow dungeons like this in the core game, but the cell is missing in Honest Hearts, and it seems they never even had time to start work on an interior for it. There's several unused ant refuse loot containers that were likely meant for this location. The 01 prefix implies there might have been multiple ant dungeons, and it's possible there was even a quest plan for it. The player already has to deal with bighorners and Yao Guai that are a danger to the dead horses / sorrows, so why not giant ants too? There's even a giant ant queen who was most likely going to be the dungeon's boss. She's added to the DLC's ant faction, but was never used sadly. In the final game, there's only a single giant ant queen at the location Ant Mound in South Vegas. It seems that after this was cut, they covered the entrance with rocks. This would have been a perfect location to use the new bug spray weapon, or it might have even been found here. Honest Hearts needed more interesting interiors, and the Ant Burrow, giant ant queen boss, and a unique weapon definitely would have helped. There's a cut perk called Corpse Finder, but only its icon remains, and it's completely unknown what effect this perk was meant to have. Perhaps it would have highlighted corpses in the environment, or given the player some additional items when looting bodies, but there's really no telling how it would have functioned. There's a set of doors ripped off their hinges intended for one of the Ranger's substations, but it isn't used at any of them. This might imply there was meant to be another substation that was more dilapidated than the others. There's an unused activator called NVDLC02 Crafting Oven 01, and it uses Dead Money's hot plate as a model, but I'm guessing that was only a placeholder. There isn't much electricity in Zion, so perhaps it was some kind of tribal Adobe oven, but that's simply speculation. There's an unused backpack from the core game, and it seems it would have been used during the questline where the Sorrows and Dead Horses leave Zion. Seeing the tribes haul away their possessions would have been a nice touch. There's a message that reads, "Waiting will cause you to miss important events, your mission will fail." This message never appears though, and the only time you can't wait is when enemies are around. This was likely meant to be used during the last quest of the DLC, but it's unknown why it was cut. There's well over 100 containers that are set up but never actually used. The cut graves are probably the most interesting, but certain containers like filing cabinets, office desk, house cabinets, shipping containers, and suitcases were likely meant for the interiors of buildings or caves, meaning that some of these might have been intended for cut locations. The trailer showed a very large battle where the White Legs are fighting the Sorrows and Dead Horses, but there's never a fight anywhere near this size in game. This scene was likely created specifically for the trailer and wouldn't have been possible on console, but it makes me dream of a world where New Vegas actually had large-scale battles. There's a toaster beneath the ground at the Three Marys, and this is arguably the most devastating cut content in the entire DLC. How in the fuck is Salt Upon Wounds supposed to make toast? Due to its short development cycle, Honest Hearts has a few notable oversights and bugs. Fallout 3's Yao Guai were introduced, but they were never added to the list of creatures affected by the Animal Friend perk, despite the fact they should have been. Waking Cloud's unique outfit is actually placed in the footlocker found at the end of the DLC, but it wasn't marked as playable and can never even be removed from the container, let alone worn as a result. This is one of the better female armor sets in the game, so it sucks it can't be used because of a very small mistake. As a result, its Pip-Boy image can never be seen normally either. The journey to or from Zion is meant to advance the game time by 14 days, but there's a bug that causes the game time to advance by an entire year every time you travel back and forth. Joshua Graham mentions that he accepts Legion money in dialogue, but he isn't actually set up to accept Legion Denarii. The Bozar is an extremely powerful light machine gun introduced in the Gunrunner's Arsenal DLC. The Grunt perk was introduced in Honest Hearts, a perk that gives the player a 25% damage bonus with certain weapon types, including LMGs. However, the Grunt perk has no effect on the Bozar, and Josh Sawyer revealed why it doesn't. Unfortunately, because Grunt was introduced in Honest Hearts DLC, Gunrunner's Arsenal cannot reference it without introducing load order bugs. Sorry. After completing the main quest line, the player can buy weapons from Zion at Gunrunners. It seems a little incoherent for the Gunrunners to be selling war clubs and other tribal weapons, however. It would have made much more sense if a Happy Trails Caravan merchant sold them, but Josh Sawyer revealed why this wasn't possible. Sure, but with every DLC, we were removing characters from the Mojave Wasteland to save memory. Adding in new merchants would have made the problem worse. In another post, he also gave an in-game explanation for it. A northern route was open to Zion. Regardless of how the courier resolves the situation there, the weapons that are available there become available in the Mojave. The Gunrunners don't manufacture the items, but resell them.
What? No. You must be mistaken. Daniel would have told me.
During the quest Family Affair, Waking Cloud asks the player to find out what happened to her family. Daniel reveals that her children are safe, but that her husband was killed by the White Legs. The player can then promise Daniel to not tell her what happened, can lie to her about what happened, or tell her the truth. The outcome of this quest has no effect outside of Waking Cloud's ending slides, but there's an unused message that was likely connected to it titled Waking Cloud Smash. Something in Waking Cloud changes, and she fights the White Legs harder now. It's difficult to say how this was going to function, beyond giving her some combat advantage against White Legs NPCs, but it would have been a nice touch for her companion quest to have an actual effect on gameplay. Fallostrok's companion quest is called A Civilized Man's Burden, and this is a reference to The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling, a poem that encouraged the United States annexation of the Philippine Islands. This poem essentially states that it's the white man's burden to civilize the lands of non-white races for the sake of progress. In Honest Hearts, it's the player's burden to either encourage Fallostrok to explore civilization or stay home, and this decision alters his ending. The quest couldn't be more simplistic, but the morality of it is intriguing. Is the civilized world of New Vegas or the Legion better than the tribal world found in Zion? In true Fallout style, his ending slides are ambiguous and there's no correct answer, but the question itself is fascinating. The variables of the quest code show this moral quandary broken down to player told Fallostrok civilization rocks, and player told Fallostrok civilization sucks. There's a class for Followstruck, but it was never linked to his character. His tag skills were melee, sneak, and guns, but for whatever reason they ended up giving him a high survival skill and a low gun skill in the final game. From a lore perspective, these changes make sense, but having a low gun skill made him into a less useful companion. Like the core game and Dead Money's companions, both Waking Cloud and Followstruck have unused lines for being set on fire during combat. Unfortunately, Joshua Graham does not though. These were likely meant to be triggered by Whitelegs attacking with firebombs, but again the trigger for these lines was never set up. Someone at Obsidian really wanted to include brutal on fire screams, but thankfully none of these were ever used. Companions in Dead Money and Honest Hearts constantly spam dialogue, as there's only a 2-minute delay between them saying a line. This was an issue that was present with core game companions like Cass, but these would later be patched out. I'm surprised that Honest Hearts companions shipped with the exact same issues, but that's likely a result of the time constraints they were under. There's a test NPC named Bob from Accounting, and he's used to narrate the ending slides played at the conclusion of the DLC. During the development of Honest Hearts, this character caused a serious game-breaking bug. When I talked to tech producer Jason Fader, I asked him about his favorite bug during development, and he replied, "My favorite was Bob from Accounting. At the start of Honest Hearts, I think, you enter a cave and instead of emerging on the other side, you enter a dark room with an NPC named Bob from Accounting. If you spoke to him, your game crashed. We were all very confused." I'm really not sure why the intro was warping the player into the in-game slideshow or why talking to him would have caused a crash, but this is a great artifact of FNV's development. Like the base game, there's an inaccessible cell called Vendor Chest Cell, and it contains the vendor inventories of Zion's only merchants, Daniel and Joshua. There's also 3 boxes used to return any player gear given to companions when they randomly leave the player's party. Strangely, stealing from Joshua's vendor chest causes a loss of karma. There's another test cell called Test NPCs, but there are no test NPCs present and they must have been deleted. There's a duffel bag here that was used to test one of the DLC's challenges, and a campfire used to test the new crafting recipes. There are 2 NPCs who were likely placed here at one point, both of whom were used to test the DLC's new animations. There's 2 cells that were used to test the tribal skin textures. There's small rooms containing some Freeside thugs who were used as guinea pigs. There's also a massive test cell called Prefab Cave that contains a series of different cave interiors. This was used by the developers to quickly create Zion's cave systems, but as we've seen, this sadly wasn't enough to complete all the caves they wanted to include. One of Honest Hearts' core design elements was to be an accurate recreation of Zion National Park. In this regard, it was largely successful, and to this day it remains one of the most beautiful areas the series has ever seen. To the point it's inspired fans to travel there, which is really cool and a testament to the hard work of the developers. After playing the base game or other DLCs, it's genuinely refreshing to explore somewhere that doesn't feel post-apocalyptic. There are destroyed buildings and enemies, but there's many times where it's just you hiking through nature. The addition of an expanded weather system featuring storm clouds, thunder, and rain makes the environment more immersive. A subtle aspect of what makes the world space so effective is the audio design. Audio recordings were taken in Zion National Park, including water flowing through a riverbed and wind rustling the branches of trees. These ambient sounds are played constantly to great effect. Considering how much effort went into the atmosphere, it's unsurprising that some of their ideas didn't make it in. In the sound files, there's a placeholder song suggesting they were going to add a unique track at some point, but never had the opportunity. Even a single new song could have improved Zion's ambience. The majority of trees added in Honest Hearts have cool looping animations. They're technically used, but are only set up to play a single time each time the game launches. These animations were likely cut because of consoles, but it's possible the animations needed additional polish. There's 7 sound files for trees that aren't cut, but perhaps these noises would have been synced to the animations. Modder Carbon Waffle added these back in his mod Trees Animation Restored. Notably, one of the trees made for Honest Hearts isn't used at all. There's an unused animated building intended for the Sorrows camp, and the tarp sways in the wind. Many of the tribal buildings have similar tarps, and I'm guessing at least some of them were meant to be animated objects too, but memory limits caused them to be cut. Only a few promotional screenshots were posted in the lead up to Honest Hearts release. Nearly all of them aren't notable in any way, except this one, which is very interesting. This image shows significantly greener night skies than anything that appears in the final game. This weather looked gorgeous, and I wish they had left it in. Like New Vegas's Wasteland, Honest Hearts World Space was made using scaled-down USGS survey data of Zion National Park. The core game of New Vegas is very lacking in terms of verticality, but the DLCs and Honest Hearts in particular improved upon that flaw. During my interview with area designer Charlie Staples, I asked him about this improvement. This was a combination of our area designers and world builders being more experienced, and us also wanting to push our environments more to be a bit more visually impressive and fun for players to move around. We focused on smaller environments that had a bit more detail put into each part of them compared to the base game. This verticality would lead to one of my favorite aspects of Honest Hearts, leaping from high spots down into the water below. Josh Sawyer revealed this was an intentional design decision. In the places where players were most likely to cliff dive, I had the world builders lower the riverbed. During the intro of Fallout 3's DLC The Pit, a raider uses a cool animation to climb down a building. It seems they considered using this in Honest Hearts, as there's an unused test version of the animation and an unused AI package. I love the way this animation looks, and it would have been really cool to have White Legs leap down from above and attack the player. This would have been amazing in the intro ambush scene, or at any point really. While this verticality looks amazing, it ended up causing some issues. It's not uncommon to find enemies clipping into geometry inside cliffs or underneath the ground. During one of the quests, the player can rescue a lost bighorner calf and return it to its mother. The mother spawns inside of cliffs so often that there's literally code that teleports her from out of bounds. The terrain is the main culprit for actors getting trapped, but it partially stems from the way they're spawned. A while back, I covered the cut random spawning system intended for the base game. While it never made it into the initial release, this system would be reworked and finally used in Honest Hearts. During my interview with area designer Jorge Salgado, I asked him about it. The Gek could not spawn a variable number of creatures through a single spawner in the way I would have liked, so I devised a system that pulled from a set of existing critters. Every one of them already tracked by the engine through their unique IDs, and then randomized how many of these to teleport into desired locations when desired. For example, as the player entered an area. I did not use this in FNV, but it served me to polish an expanded system that then I did put into place in one of the DLCs, Honest Hearts. This system allowed us to have a random number of creatures and types from which to populate encounters, while at the same time, letting us create complex scripted behaviors for them because, as I said, the creatures had unique IDs. These were essential for handcrafted scripted behaviors in that engine. From what I can glean, these enemies are spawned and resurrected when needed in a cell called Zion Encounter Interior, a giant floor that's basically purgatory. These creatures are then teleported when the player approaches one of the many triggers placed in the world. As a result, you can visit the same area multiple times and find it inhabited by a totally different type/number of creatures. Sometimes creatures will spawn right in front of you, which isn't great, great, but most of the time it works well. As far as why this was used, instead of the way creatures were hand-placed in the core game, Jorge Salgado eloquently explained his reasoning in a script note. Due to the size of Zion and to the significantly smaller amount of time that players will spend here compared to the Mojave, encounters in Honest Hearts are not meant to simulate a living ecosystem. Here we will treat them as encounters that are already prearranged, triggered, and then presented to players. Unlike in New Vegas, where populations persisted through game time and game space, creating a complex web of interactions. Honest Hearts has been heavily criticized for its depiction of Native Americans. Josh Sawyer responded to these complaints stating, "I understand why people see it that way, but how the DLC shipped was not how it was planned. The tribes in Zion are descendants of a mix of North American native people, as well as other American citizens and European of various non-native ethnicities, tourists/campers. This survives in the language of the Dead Horses, for example, who use a large number of German-derived words. In the first design docs for Honest Hearts, every tribe was supposed to have members from all of F3/FNV ethnic groups. However, there was a complicating factor: body art. The various tattoos and body paints we needed to texture the bodies multiplied the number of required textures. They couldn't simply be layered on as they can in Fallout 4, but they were entirely new body textures that dramatically increased the amount of texture memory being used. For that reason, each tribe ended up only having one body texture per sex. This compressed their ethnicities into homogenized blends, with Dead Horses being a darker tan, Sorrows a light tan, and the white legs, under the body paint, fairly pale. As a minor point, Daniel was specifically supposed to be, and was in data for most of development, Asian. I don't know when, how, or why he was switched to Caucasian, but that's how he shipped. It's frustrating. Because those changes slot Joshua and Daniel as white guys among mostly brown folk, when 1, they weren't supposed to be white guys, and 2, the tribes were specifically called out as ethnically and culturally mixed without any real-world analogs. Regarding the natives as aesthetic criticism, the patterns we used for the 3 tribes' body art are not based on any current or historical Native American body art as far as I know. There are in-fiction explanations for each tribe's specific choices. The Whitelegs initially colored themselves white to blend into the Great Salt Lake where they are from, and they dread their hair out of reverence for Ulysses. The Sorrows use the river pattern to reflect their suffering and their connection to the Virgin River in Zion. The Dead Horses mark various accomplishments on their skin and decorate their clubs with 45 shells out of their respect for Joshua Graham. In another post, he expanded even further, stating, "I don't think it's vitally important to determine exactly how it would go, as much as it is to acknowledge that the people being helped have agency and voices of their own. Fallistrok and Waking Cloud are good characters, but they were followers of Joshua Graham and Daniel more than the drivers of the plotline. Lawrence of Arabia was another inspiration for Honest Hearts, because it's another example of a colonizer stepping in and trying to help, but a difference between Lawrence of Arabia and the mission is that Lawrence of Arabia has Sharif Ali, played by Omar Sharif, as a full participant in / objector to what's happening. The mission and Mississippi Burning and unfortunately Honest Hearts all feature a pair of outsiders wrestling with moral quandaries to figure out what to do, while the locals go, if you say so, quietly in the background. Even the pidgin languages the tribe speak in Honest Hearts were just an attempt to keep costs down. All of the DLCs feature very few speaking characters because Fallout games have localized text and VO. That includes background characters and the reactive barks, so we made pidgin languages for the tribes so they wouldn't need to be re-recorded. Of course, the tribes were also supposed to be multi-ethnic, so you'd see white dead horses, black dead horses, etc. And again, Daniel was supposed to be Asian. It was incredibly frustrating to get halfway through production, only to discover that making ethnic variants for every tribe would completely blow out the already limited in-game memory limit. It wasn't a problem of, this will take more work, but this game will crash as soon as the area loads. And it was white-hot inferno rage when I saw the ship version of Daniel had been set to Caucasian. I honestly don't know how or why it happened. Sometimes developers accidentally change data when editing something else and don't even realize they've changed something. For all I know, it could have been me. In any case, the confluence of changes and omissions just resulted in it looking pretty bad. This isn't just talk either. The Dead Horses, Sorrows, and White Legs all have their own unused African-American race. Many NPCs that appear in Honest Hearts use the same race naming convention from the core game, like AAM, which is short for African-American Male. There is even an unused NPC using the Asian Male naming convention. This can be restored by the mod Tribal Race Restoration by Oni Keaton.
Perhaps you do not fully understand the new Canaanites. I have seen the Father's images. His holy bride and holy son were given unto the world to save it. They dwelt in the caverns of the mountains, caverns which can still be seen today.
One of Honest Heart's biggest flaws are its characters or lack thereof, but it does contain two of Fallout's greatest characters, and one of these is the Survivalist. Randall Clark has one of New Vegas's best written, most compelling stories, made even more impressive by the fact it's told only through notes. Near the location The Airy, there's a giant mural dedicated to the Survivalist, and this is probably my favorite piece of graffiti in the game. Randall Clark is mythically depicted in the center, his unique service rifle is painted to his right, and it's raining death upon the dwellers of Vault 22 below. To the left are two figures who represent Sylvie and the survivalist son who died during childbirth. There's some hidden supplies right above the mural that can only be reached by jumping off the cliff. There's a disabled map marker here named Airy Survivalist Cache. The internal name of the map marker is Airy Cave, and the name of the cell this is contained in is Sector A Cave, suggesting this is yet another cut interior. The mural is one giant model, and the entrance to the cave was seemingly an integral part of its design. At one point in development, traveling to the summit of the area while Follows Chalk was in your party would have revealed this location. Given its proximity to the mural, this was almost certainly meant to be one of the caves used by Randall Clark. Presumably the Sorrows painted this mural at this specific point because the father in the cave lived here. Southeast of the mural, there's some hidden supplies obscured by trees. There's a disabled map marker here, and the name the player would have seen when discovering it was Survivalist Cache. You could already infer these supplies were left by the Survivalist, but it's awesome learning its lost name. One of these survivalist caches is found at the location Two Skies Cave. Not far from the cave, there's a bed and some gear hidden by trees. There's a disabled map marker here, and its Spanish name translates to Black Branch Cave. The name suggests this is yet another cut dungeon, but again it seems they didn't have time to work on the interior, and that they covered the entrance after it got the axe. The name the player would have seen when discovering the map marker was called Stalker's Camp, but no Dead Horse stalkers ever utilize it. It's interesting that the cave name is in Spanish, and that it's so close to Two Skies Cave, implying it was named by the Spanish-speaking group that was destroyed by the Vault 22 dwellers. Perhaps this was intended to be one of the locations they stayed at, and maybe there even would have been remnants of their society. Reaching the summit of the spine while Follows Chalk was in your party once revealed this location as well. It seems the Survivalist had a few more stories to tell, but they were unfortunately casualties of Honest Heart's short development. Josh Sawyer actually went to Zion National Park to research the location, and this trip would lead to the Survivalist logs. I can't speak for John Gonzalez, who wrote the actual dialogue, but I believe I developed the idea while backpacking in Zion on my own, and reading The Pearl of Great Price by Joseph Smith before bed every night. I thought of a non-believer surviving the Great War and living in isolation there, seeing other people come and go, and how how his own beliefs and relationship to the world would change over time. I also thought the idea of this person becoming some sort of supernatural figure to locals that was later syncretized with the Christian God would be interesting. In another post, he continued, "The survivalist content was extremely simple. I talked to John Gonzalez about the rough outline of Randall Clark's life, and ended it pointing to Red Gate, where you find a really powerful, unique weapon. Hooray." The logs lead to one of the most powerful weapons in FNV, the Survivalist Rifle. Some players thought its misaligned sights were a bug, but Josh Sawyer confirmed this was intentional. It's not a bug. The Survivalist Rifle was used by the Survivalists for decades, and shows signs of improvised repair. The clamps on the foregrip wood, the mismatched wood furniture, etc. The bent front sight is damage that the Survivalists couldn't or didn't repair, and just adapted to using as is. If you aim at the right front post, that's where the bullets are going. One of the most distinctive elements of the Survivalist logs is the terse writing style. It's written poetically, almost like prose, and yet the grammatical errors suggest it was written by someone uneducated. Josh Sawyer revealed more about the Survivalist background in a post. "John and I thought of the Survivalist as a clever ex-military man without a lot of formal education. The Survivalist is experienced at living and traveling in the wilderness, so he uses his general experience and quick wits to survive in Zion. Some close examination of his rifle also gives some clues about his life before the war." This isn't cut content, but I've always thought it was a missed opportunity that you couldn't tell the sorrows about the Survivalist after finding all of his logs. The DLC's other intriguing character is of course Joshua Graham. His writing and voice acting are some of the very best in the game. Like many other elements of the DLCs, he was inspired by Black Isle's cancelled Fallout 3. In Van Buren, Joshua Graham was known as the Hanged Man and was the strongest companion. This was offset by him getting the player in trouble constantly due to his past and his actions. Throughout the core game, the Burn Man is referenced in dialogue, loading screens, and graffiti, which made him a somewhat mythical character leading into Honest Heart's release. Perhaps due to this build-up and Van Buren, some fans were left disappointed by the way he appeared. Josh Sawyer commented on how his character changed between his conception and his eventual appearance. In Van Buren, he was a horrible monster without many redeeming qualities. Terrible past and current bad attitude, generally nasty all around, kind of like adventuring with Kaiser Soze. I think it's worth noting that even in Van Buren's documents, a lot of the references to the Hanged Man's evil refers to past acts. In Van Buren, he was seemingly a man without purpose. While his characterization by others and his tendency to laugh off/ignore attempts by others to control him could have been interesting, it really ended at nasty guy who says and does creepy stuff and is a badass. There were specific instances, such as at New Canaan, where he would specifically avoid conflict and showed some additional depth, but he effectively had no character arc within the story. Personally, I think the wow so crazy type characters aren't particularly interesting or insightful because they only exist in pure fantasy and as such can't really be related to. I think it's important for characters who are influencing player opinions to be more or less human. If you can't put yourself in the character's shoes, it's hard to empathize with him or her. Joshua was inspired by a lot of different characters and things. The Apostle Paul, Rodrigo Mendoza, Robert De Niro's character from Roland Joffe's The Mission, T.E. Lawrence, aka Lawrence of Arabia, and others. His outfit was designed to feature body armor, but looks somewhat Old West/preacher in style, hence the low-collar white shirt, sleeve garter, and the cut of the ballistic vest. The rattlesnake skin on his belt, shoes, and gun are symbolic, but also intended to reflect that Western feeling. The stitch patterns in his shirt were supposed to be tribal markings from the dead horses, and were inspired by a scene from The Mission where Mendoza receives patterned body paint from the Guarani. I remembered a white dress from PJ Harvey's White Chalk tour, where she had lyrics stitched into the cloth in black thread, and I just put the two ideas together. Josh Sawyer revealed that even some team members shared the same complaint about the character. During development, some people on the development team complained that Joshua Graham was not a huge monster of a man who appeared by flying in on a chariot of fire wearing a necklace of human heads. Turning him into a physical giant or typical badass would have weakened his humanity and monstrosity, I think. I wanted him to be engaging in a mundane activity when the player first encountered him. Fallish Truck does build up Joshua along the way to the camp, but you can easily miss the triggers if you don't go directly to the camp. I've also noticed that a lot of people miss the huge mural of Joshua Graham and white leg corpses painted below it. Now that I think about it, I can't remember anyone talking about the Survivalist mural that's near the center of the map. It illustrates the Sorrow's belief in the Father in the Cave. I think we could have done a better job presenting these things, but some of it can be chalked up to the open environment and the rest to iteration time. To some, his initial encounter was disappointing in that he's simply maintaining a stack of weapons, but there was a specific goal in mind here, as Josh Sawyer explained. It was very important to me that Joshua comes across as a real person. That's one of the reasons why when you first encounter him, he's doing something mundane. I wanted the player's first encounter with Joshua to be very reductive. In a way, I wanted the player to be initially disappointed. They hear legends of this fearsome, terrible, demonic figure, and when they first see him, he's doing the equivalent of putting his pants on one leg at a time, sitting at a table, maintaining a stack of guns. Even internally, some people complained about his appearance. They wanted him to be huge and monstrous, or they wanted his first encounter with the player to involve him brutally gunning down white legs. I believe that for his character to feel right in the context of the story, he needed to be a man first and the monster later. But that expressed desire on the team made me ask for the graffiti players see on the way to see Joshua, an entire cliff face dominated by the image of Joshua, with tiny white legs corpses falling down below him. In the image, he's like Goya's Saturn, dwarfing and destroying everyone around him. In another post, he revealed that he initially considered making Joshua Graham like his Van Buren counterpart. I had wanted to develop a religious conflict in an RPG for a while, one that wasn't presented as pro-religion versus anti-religion. I didn't want to use a proxy/fictitious religion, and I didn't want to use religion as the setup for a series of jokes. My first idea for Honest Hearts was a direct conflict between Joshua and Daniel, where Joshua was more like his pre-fall self, but I didn't think the characterization would be particularly interesting, and I didn't think players would struggle much with the decision of whom to support. It didn't take long for me to change the main conflict to one about Joshua and Daniel versus an external threat, with the players' choices revolving around which leader to support. I think we often present players with a choice between two bad solutions, and we ask them to decide which one is least bad. With Honest Hearts, I wanted the player to decide which solution would produce the most good. Another downside of the main questline is that you're forced to choose between Daniel and Joshua, when Joshua is not only a more interesting character, but it's objectively more difficult to support Daniel's plan to leave Zion. War never changes in the Fallout universe, and no matter how far the tribes run, there'll always be another group like the Whitelegs. Josh Sawyer commented on this asymmetrical design. Presenting the conflict with Daniel posed some challenges, because Daniel is not a living legend, i.e., he is even more of a normal man than Joshua is trying to be. Additionally, Mormonism is not a pacifist religion, and its soteriology does not depend on pacifism, so the conflict could not reasonably be framed around violence versus non-violence, even in the post-apocalyptic version followed by the New Canaanites. Daniel's concern was about larger issues than fighting or not fighting. He was concerned that Joshua's lapsed nature would cause a whirlwind of warfare that would pull everyone far away from New Canaanite traditions, to the point where religion was virtually abandoned in favor of a war cult surrounding Joshua. I had expected that most people would support Joshua, in part because of Joshua as a character, but also because of the nature of gameplay in Fallout, i.e., violence is almost always the solution. I did not expect that these survivalist logs would push so many people towards supporting Joshua. I think it's an interesting example of players finding their own connections between the two stories, and making an emotional connection that pushes them in a particular direction. In another post, he continued, "I should say that I totally understand why the majority of people side with Joshua. Daniel's viewpoint has a large amount of additional weight if you share his basic beliefs about Christian salvation. If you don't, people usually perceive the value of their innocence as minor or even negative. It seems sort of obvious to say this, but if you don't fundamentally believe the universe works the way that Daniel believes it does, he's never going to be particularly convincing." One of Honest Heart's most notable elements is its serious take on religion. Josh Sawyer revealed his process for implementing it into the story. Chris had an idea for overarching themes and stories. I was the director on only one of those, which was Honest Hearts, which Chris pretty much just said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I want to do this." And he worked with me to tie the story of Joshua Graham and Ulysses and Caesar together so that the whole arc of the DLC makes sense. In Honest Hearts, I wanted to convey the sense of wonder which I found in going to Zion in real life. So my goal with the team was that I wanted to make the prettiest environment that we can in this engine, a beautiful natural setting, and build it around the idea of these tribes coming together and fighting, with Joshua Graham sort of in the center of it. Also, the other big goal that I had for Honest Hearts was that I wanted to have a real-world religion as a major theme in the story that was dealt with seriously and not as a joke. Well, religion often in games is used sort of as a joke. It's used for humor, it's not taken seriously, and it's not really examined in much depth. Honest Hearts is really, fundamentally, about Joshua Graham and Daniel's Christianity, and how they view their beliefs, how the Sorrows view their beliefs, where the disconnect between those beliefs are, the problems with imprinting this missionary work onto these people who are unfamiliar with it, and how they misinterpret those symbols. Also, it's a very classical prodigal son story. Joshua Graham was this missionary who went away and became this horrible monster, and then came back and tried to redeem himself, and now is at the verge of falling back into this very monstrous behavior. So yeah, that was the goal I had with that. Then with Old World Blues, there's a very heavy focus on humor, much more so even than the base game, a very specific type of humor. And I can't take credit for that. It was the one DLC I didn't work on at all. So with each of those games we had a different focus and we're trying to accomplish different things. And with DLC, we kind of know how these sell over time, so really our goal was to try and make something with a little bit of cool stuff, some cool gear, some cool new perks, and sprinkle them around to make sure people get all of the cool new stuff, and then come up with a cool new idea that feels distinct that people will really want to pursue, and just execute on it. Even if people won't like it, it's probably still good. It's only 5, 6, or 7 hours, so if someone is like meh about it, that's at least a safer place to try weird ideas than in the core game, where you have to build a whole game around it. Honest Hearts is not only unique for its serious approach to religion, but also for its depiction of Mormonism. Josh Sawyer revealed why he focused on the Mormon faith. I always intended Joshua Graham to be some type of post-apocalyptic Mormon, mostly due to the historical presence and influence of Mormons in Utah. In Van Buren, I thought it could be a subtle background thing that players could pick up on, not a major part of his personality. It wasn't until New Vegas/Honest Hearts that I thought he should be returned to the fold with the new Canaanites. I'm reticent to give a strict label to Joshua Graham's beliefs, since there is no true Christian/Mormon/Catholic/Lutheran, and people would simply debate the label. Ultimately, every individual's beliefs are personal. Joshua and Daniel are both New Canaanites, and both cite scripture, and express beliefs in soteriological concepts that are also found in modern-day Mormon teachings. Obviously, they are not a part of a larger organization similar to the current LDS, and how they practice their faith might be wholly unrecognizable given their post-apocalyptic outlook. However you want to label them, they both make it very clear that they believe that Jesus Christ equals salvation for the world's people. Really, I think that what they believe is more important than how their beliefs are labeled.
In a world filled with misery and uncertainty, it is a great comfort to know that, in the end, there is light in the darkness.
Daniel and Joshua's religiously inspired dialogue is considered to be one of the DLC's strongest elements. Both incorporate parts of the Pauline epistles and the Gospels into their dialogue. Josh Sawyer revealed his inspiration for their lines, stating, "I studied religious history in college, specifically witch hunting in Europe, and took some supplemental religious study courses, one oriented around the New Testament. Joshua especially examines actions and events through a biblical lens. Putting things into a biblical context reinforces his rationalization of his actions and the actions of those around him. E.g., the courier is a good neighbor like the Samaritan, salt upon wounds is the ram in the thicket, and Joshua is Abraham offering up a sacrifice to God." In another post, Josh Sawyer spoke on Honest Heart's themes. The overarching theme of Fallout New Vegas is about trying to recreate a new world in the image of the old world. Honest Hearts is about how the New Canaanites are following in the footsteps of their Mormon ancestors, bringing Mormonism, or trying to the wasteland. It's also intended to contrast the Mojave wasteland both visually and in character. So much of what we see in Fallout New Vegas is damaged, corrupted, or worn down by the war and the centuries of misery that have followed. Zion remains untouched. Both Joshua and Daniel see an unspoiled purity in it that they cannot let be ruined. Daniel sees something similar in the Sorrows, which harkens back to noble savage myths. Honest Hearts drew inspiration from a plethora of other sources as well. The name of the DLC came from the Brigham Young quote, "Honest hearts produce honest actions." It took some inspiration from the Utah War, an armed conflict between Mormon settlers in the territory of Utah and US military forces. In 1857, at the height of the tension between the groups, there was a mass killing now known as the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Over 100 civilians were traveling in a caravan through the region when they were attacked and killed by a Mormon militia. This inspiration is mirrored in the final battle at the Three Marys. Joshua Graham's dynamic with the Sorrows and Dead Horses was partially based on the Brigham Young book, Blood of the Prophets. Josh Sawyer commented on this inspiration, stating, "Yes, but less about Brigham Young specifically, and more about how Mormons in Utah interacted with tribes there generally. It was inspired by events like the Utah War/Mountain Meadows Massacre. Even though this doesn't appear in-game, Joshua Graham's character class in the GEC is Destroying Angel, which was a nickname for some of the militant/vigilante Mormon/Danites that operated in Utah in the 19th century. As he mentioned, the Burn Man's class is indeed the Destroying Angel." Joshua Graham's choices at the end of the game were partially inspired by the Wilfred Owen poem, The Parable of Old Men and Young. This poem takes the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac and compares it to World War I. One of the main inspirations was the 1986 film The Mission, which follows the exploits of a missionary in 18th century South America. Josh Sawyer spoke on this in a forum post, stating, "Daniel has found the one society in the Fallout universe to live outside the rule that war never changes. So it's pretty understandable that he would try to preserve that, even if he doesn't have the best plan to do so and couches everything in a patronizing missionary mindset. In The mission, Roland Jaffe directed a great scene where the rehabilitating slaver Mendoza reads from 1 Corinthians 13 and shows him and the Jesuits interacting with the Guarani. At the end of the passage, he's sitting near a river as one of the Guarani boys spears a fish. It's really fantastic punctuation. I've linked the scene below if you want to check it out, but fair warning, it's a genuinely depressing film. Josh Sawyer spoke on it even further in a separate post. Honest Hearts was heavily inspired by the mission, which presumes a state of existence where the colonizers have already hosed up the lives of the people they are ostensibly trying to help, and are now trying to find a path out of it either through head-on violence or retreat. When asked if Joshua Graham's character was inspired by Captain Kurtz from the film Apocalypse Now, Josh Sawyer replied, "Only slightly. Graham and Caesar were in it together in different ways. While Caesar never had a radical shift in his approach and ideology, Joshua Graham had a slow slide followed by a dramatic fall and rebirth." Joshua Graham was inspired by characters like Rodrigo Mendoza from The Mission and T.E. Lawrence. That said, Honest Hearts has a lot to do with personal motivations and why being honest to yourself about them is important. In many ways, Caesar is dispassionate, or at least less passionate than someone like Joshua Graham or even Lannius. Caesar is an odd sort of philosopher. Joshua Graham is a zealot. Caesar is also hypocritical, or at least bends his own rules when it suits him. Joshua has to lie to himself to rationalize what he does. He can't live with an internal contradiction. They are also very different types of leaders. Caesar leads by telling people what to do and wowing or terrorizing them with the results. Joshua Graham leads by personally doing things that typically terrify both his allies and his enemies. As Joshua says himself, he's effectively a war chief of the dead horses. He's not the sort of guy you ask for opinions on how to repair a road or develop infrastructure.
If the 80s had wanted to kill us, we would have been dead. Guess they figured we weren't worth the trouble.
There are several dialogue references to a motorcycle raider gang called the 80s. This faction was originally made by Josh Sawyer for a Fallout tabletop game, and he later recycled them for Honest Hearts. Many of New Vegas's characters were inspired by the Van Buren tabletop games, so it's fitting that some of its lore was inspired by other tabletop games too. The Sneering Imperialist perk is one of the most memorable Vault Boy images. Concept artist Brian Menzies used the Sharp series as a reference, a book series by Bernard Cornwall that follows a soldier in the British Army during the Napoleonic Wars. Honest Hearts has more cut content than I initially expected, despite the small development team and how little time they had. It is, however, likely that it and the other DLCs have additional cut content that will always remain a mystery. When I spoke to Charlie Staples, he mentioned, since the DLCs had a lot less production time, we were a lot more focused on the DLCs and making sure the content we were creating was worthwhile and going to be used. We also made an effort to clean up any unused content so the patch/update sizes would be smaller. Honest Hearts would have benefited more from additional time than any of the other DLCs, or the core game for that matter. Considering the circumstances of its development, it's much better than it could have been, and despite its flaws, there are many elements of it that I love. These changes would have made Fallout New Vegas into an even better game. Ultimately though, all of this was left on the cutting room floor.